believe in the UK.
No bias, no censorship.
It just doesn't make sense to me. He wasn't doing his job as Chancellor.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton Tonight on TV, radio and online, Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Every Friday and Sunday night from 9, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
We're on the same page again. There's something weird happening.
Let Ian finish. Don't be such a cranky.
That mini budget was the tip of the iceberg.
And on Saturday, my show just got bigger. From 8, it's Mark Dolan's Saturday Night In.
You can't govern a country if you can't speak.
Stop talking.
My God, we reached the end. I've never been early in my life. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Good morning, it's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. Whilst everyone might be talking about the glorious result in the football last night, there is politics going on too. The Prime Minister faces Sir Keir Starmer in PMQs today, and the government explores whether it should crack down on groups like Extinction Rebellion. There's so much more to talk about, including Tory rebellions, when aren't there, and we'll explore it all after the headlines.
A very good morning. It's 9:32. I'm Rosie Wright. Let's get you up to date. A major trial of an experimental Alzheimer drug has shown for the first time that the very early stages of the disease can be slowed. Scientists found that after 18 months of the drug, it stalled the disease progression by 27% compared with patients who are taking a placebo. However, the experts warn, as the medicine works during the initial stages of the disease, most won't benefit without a revolution in spotting it. The results published in the New England Journal of Medicine have been hailed as the beginning of the end. The Labour MP, Stephen Kinnock, whose mother had the disease, welcomed the news.
I would just encourage anyone, any family that thinks there might be some signs of this in the family to get that diagnosis as quickly as possible. And to, if we can, start to use this drug as soon as possible. I understand it's still going through some final stages of clinical trials, etc. But it's a hugely positive development. Tragically, sadly, too late for my mum, but I hope will really help other families.
Postal and education services are going to be affected by strikes today as industrial action gets underway across multiple industries. 150 universities and colleges will be impacted, and so will 77 sixth form colleges in England as National Education Union staff go on strike. And Royal Mail staff start another 2-day strike. They're all in disputes over pay. Meanwhile, ambulance workers across England are planning to strike before Christmas. It's part of a dispute over pay and staffing levels. Unison said thousands of 999 call handlers, ambulance technicians and paramedics will strike across the North, London, Yorkshire and the South West. Food inflation's risen to 12.4%. It's a record high since they began 17 years ago. The British Retail Consortium says the figure's nearly doubled since October as rocketing energy, animal feed and transport costs have forced up prices. We're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Now back to the briefing with Tom.
Very good morning to you. It's 9:34 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood. Now, where's the lay of the land this morning? Well, the Tory pro-wind farm rebellion now outnumbers the Tory majority in Parliament. But there's a counter-amendment charge being led by the anti-wind farm MP, Sir John Hayes. He claims now to have 19 pro-ban backers compared to the almost 40 Tories who want to end the ban. Some battle lines being drawn up there. And it's busy for the Home Secretary today too, as Suella Braverman is to chair a meeting of the National Policing Board this afternoon. No doubt high on her agenda will be looking at how to deal with a series of environmental protesters. Of course, those domestic issues are on top of a broader border problems, with David Davis's migration letter earlier this week having attracted widespread support from Tory MPs. But what of the Labour Party? Well, of course, Sir Keir Starmer will face the Prime Minister at PMQs later today, but stories people are talking about aren't the ones that he's been promoting. Starmer's Corbyn-era policy of levying extra taxes on private school fees have been put under the microscope. And, interestingly, rumours are swirling of the Prince across the water, the once heir to Blair, David Miliband, perhaps returning from New York to British politics. Well, let's discuss it all this morning with Ben Glaze, the Deputy Political Editor of the Daily Mirror. And Ben, let's start off with these two rival amendments or I'm not sure if Sir John Hayes has actually laid his amendment, but he's laying the groundwork for it, claiming 19 backers compared to Simon Clarke's almost 40. Where does number 10 stand on the issue of whether wind farms should be unbanned?
Well, at the moment, Rishi Sunak is trying to weigh up which is the least evil. Is he going to lose more support by saying, yes, OK, let's relax the de facto ban on onshore wind turbines, or is he going to lose more support by sticking with it? Now, this has all sort of been thrown into sharp light, really, because of the energy price crisis following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Onshore wind is by far and away the cheapest form of electricity, renewables, because when the wind blows, they are cheap, but the problem is of the last few days we haven't had a lot of wind, so the amount of energy that we've generated from these wind farms has been less than we would expect. Now, the ban was brought in by David Cameron in 2015, soon after the Lib Dem coalition fizzled out with that general election victory. And there's been an uneasy Tory truce around it ever since. But now you do have these two rival camps that the Prime Minister is seeking to balance, and he's going to have to make a decision. Meetings are going on at the moment and over the next few days, but eventually he's going to have to come down on one side or the other.
Interesting, perhaps, that the pro-onshore wind, crucially with community consent in the amendment that was tabled by Simon Clarke, that amendment has the support of Boris Johnson and of Liz Truss and of a number of big beasts. It looked like it has more support on the face of it than the anti-wind farm group. Has the Tory party shifted in this area?
Yeah, I think it has, actually. If you go back a few years, and obviously that's a few parliaments ago, considering the number of general elections we've had in recent years, back in the day, then Conservative MPs were largely against onshore wind. But because of what's happened in the Ukraine, and because you've got younger, more modern politicians, if you like, within the Conservative Party. They do seem to be leaning towards bringing wind onshore. I mean, there's no dispute over whether or not we should have offshore development. You can have giant turbines out at sea. Britain's one of the world leaders in offshore
Saudi Arabia of offshore wind, as Boris Johnson liked to say.
That's right, that's right. Now, Rishi Sunak might have a way out, because if he says it's with local consent, well, if you look at the polls, people are generally in favour of onshore wind, but when you drill down, are they in favour of it in their backyard? So if you say you'll have it with local consent, well, that's allowing it in principle, but you may be able to say, well, it's in your hands, and if people don't want a wind farm looming over their house, and they may be able to snub them in the long term.
In much the same sort of community consent mechanism that Jacob Rees-Mogg was drawing up around onshore shale gas extraction and fracking. It seems like a sort of similar sort of thing. But moving on, the Home Secretary is, of course, hosting this roundtable today of senior police leaders, and we're led to believe this is mainly going to be focusing on these groups that sort of sit in motorways, smash windows, cause criminal damage in pursuit of political aims.
That's right. Now, this is the National Policing Board, which is made up of senior police leaders, senior government figures from the Home Office, and some police and crime commissioners. It meets once every 3 months, 4 times a year. It was actually set up by Boris Johnson in July 2019. Now, at this meeting that the Home Secretary is chairing, we understand she's going to be pressing these police chiefs to crack down, really, on these environmental protesters who've been gluing themselves to paintings and gluing themselves to the road, marching down streets, holding up the traffic, and generally causing quite a lot of public nuisance. We understand that Rishi Sunak blew up, basically, at officials about 2 weeks ago in Number 10, saying it's ridiculous, why can't the police arrest these people? Because, obviously, there's a very, very small minority. Many people might agree with their aims, but they certainly don't agree with their tactics. So I think we'll see some of that frustration come out this afternoon when the Home Secretary chairs that board.
And often it's sort of the same people who are sort of arrested and re-arrested doing the same things. I wonder, though, because Rishi Sunak has been coming under this criticism from the Labour Party leader of being weak, of not being able to sort of get his own ideas through, if he has indeed any ideas of his own. What does it say that he's sort of promoting this meeting today, that he's looking to do more around this area? Is that to counter this charge of being a weak Prime Minister?
I think in the last couple of weeks, really, we've seen the senior Labour figures really focus on Rishi Sunak as weak, trying to, it's not just Keir Starmer who's saying it. Senior shadow cabinet figures are using interviews to use weakness. He's weak. It goes back to the mid-90s when Tony Blair famously said to John Major across the dispatch box, weak, weak, weak. Now, of course, when John Major, he was dealing with the Maastricht rebels. He had a majority of about 20-odd that dwindled as the Parliament went on. Rishi Sunak's not in the same position. He's got a working majority of about 70-odd. It's not the same, but the malaise around the Conservative Party, that is redolent of what we saw in the mid-90s, and certainly Labour think they might end up with a similar result to 1997. But the sort of class war, really, that Labour's sort of going down with this private schools exemption, this is the VAT exemption, well, a lot of people, again, think private schools shouldn't have this VAT exemption, and it's driven by one newspaper at the moment, the focus on that.
It is interesting that the Daily Mail is promoting this so much, because you'd think that perhaps it's not the worst policy to promote in terms of a populist sense. Now, we can argue about the reality of it. Of course, private schools are charities for a reason. They offer all these bursaries and help to state schools and all the rest of it. You can argue about the particulars of whether thousands of children flooding into the state sector would be a harm, or whether losing schools in their entirety would be an issue as well. But to promote it as a big dividing line seems a little odd.
Yeah, it's 7% of the nation's children are educated at private schools at the moment. I don't think this is the big issue that anyone really wants to die on, and the way that it's been dealt with over the past few years, and you referred to it earlier as a Corbynite policy. Well, it is. Maybe Starmer does want to stick with it, try and throw a bit of red meat to some of the hardcore lefties, if you like, on his back bench.
So we don't have much time, but I do want to touch on this story that has bubbled up in the last 48 hours. David Miliband, might he be returning to the Labour Party fold?
He's shown a bit of ankle, isn't he? He never rules it out. This is, regularly, about once a year, maybe once every sort of 8-9 months, he does an interview. He's always asked, might you have a comeback? And he never says never. He's been running the International Rescue Committee in New York, a charity, for the last 9 years. He doesn't show any real signs of coming back, but never quite ruling it out. He's dangling it, isn't he? He's a bit of a
and it does
tease.
seem like this formation of the Labour Party would be more welcoming to the arch-Blairite Miliband to come back than any other form.
Certainly more welcoming, whether or not there'd be a big enough space to fill quite a big ego, I'm not sure.
Well, one to keep an eye on. Ben Glaze, thank you very much for talking through those key issues for us there. Well, moving on today, the Justice Committee has called on the government to re-sentence all prisoners subject to imprisonment for public protection sentences. In a report that was published in September, the committee found that the current regime for managing what are called IPP prisoners is inadequate in supporting their specific needs and called for swift changes to improve the quality of support that is given. Under this IPP sentencing system, release is based on successful rehabilitation and prisoners no longer being deemed a risk to the general public. Well, James Daly is the Conservative MP for Bury North and sits on the Justice Committee and joins me now. So, James, what's going on here? This report, published in September, has anything moved since then?
Well, the government are going to respond to that in the next couple of weeks. And first of all, Tom, can I thank you for allowing me to come on to speak about this, because this is not a subject that gets aired very often. And if I could just put some context in respect of this. IPP sentences were invented in 2005, and they were put in place for serious offenders who were deemed to be a continuing risk of harm to the public, but were not merit or did not merit a life sentence. So we had that situation. That caused a number of problems. In 2012, the sentences were abolished completely. But the retrospective sentences, so the sentences that happened before then, they are still in place. Right. So we now have 3,000 people still in prison subject to these sentences. And it's quite stark, the figures. So 600 of those people who are still in prison have been in prison for 10 years over their tariff. And I think it's about 188 have been in prison for 10 years over a tariff which was 2 years or less. So we essentially are in a position where if one of these people who may have been sentenced a number of years ago for a 2-year custodial term could spend 40 years in prison.
Wow.
Now, if we just think about that, that's the basic and the logic as to why this sentence was got rid of in the first place. We have 3,000 people in a custodial environment. I mean, I think we can all, in one sense, think about when you put into a situation where, in your mind, you've got no hope of leaving a custodial environment. The mental health impact of that is quite substantial.
And yet, looking at the rationale for why someone would be able to leave a sentence like that is if they were no longer deemed to be a threat to the public, deemed to be violence or whatever. So surely these 3,000-odd people are deemed currently to be a threat, and isn't that a strong argument for keeping them behind bars?
Well, I don't think so. We haven't seen the evidence in respect to that. It must be the case. If that wasn't the case, then then clearly they shouldn't be there in the first place. But of the 3,000 that are in, 1,400 have been recalled, having been released. Now, 30% of those, Tom, have committed a further offence, but 70% haven't. So about 1,000 of those who are in prison now have been released from custody, not committed a criminal offence at all, but are back in for an indeterminate period. So when we get down to probably a discussion which is probably longer than the time we've got here regarding what harm and continuing risk to the public means. Now, one of the things that we have with the parole board and the process for releasing prisoners is a very risk-averse approach. I don't think any politician perhaps wants to be in a position to risk releasing somebody who may or may not commit a serious offence having been put in prison under these terms.
And it does seem that since these IPP sentences were abolished, we have seen a number of people who were arrested in prison for a short amount of time or got a non-custodial sentence and then reoffended. The reoffending rates in this country are relatively high.
The reoffending rates are abysmal, and we need to be tackling that. Obviously, there's some positive steps being made in respect of that. But the reason why I'm here today is that those 3,000 people who are in prison, from the evidence that I've seen, there are multiple mental health issues. I think that, Tom, there's a real argument as well that a lot of these people, because they have mental health issues, because their health has deteriorated in custody, because we are not providing the rehabilitation and support that people need, people are actually, risk is being should we say that people are being locked up because of their mental health. Their mental health and perhaps what would be viewed as their instability is being viewed as a risk factor, and therefore they're not being released, whereas we should have provision in the community where people can go, B, have these issues addressed and supported, and they shouldn't be in a custodial environment. There are families all over the country who watch GB News, and this is the reason why I'm here today, who are desperate. There are people who want some hope, and so I hope when the Lord Chancellor, we talked with him last week about this, will think very hard about how we can go about addressing this situation. My committee want all these people to be resentenced. Those who are viewed to be a harm, they can continue. A sentence can be imposed, which would reflect.
So it's just a reassessment of those.
It's a resentence for every single one of those, and some may well pose a serious risk of harm going forward, and that will be taken into account by the expert panel that we've proposed. But importantly, there's a lot of people who won't. There's a lot of people who should be in support facilities, have mental health support in the community. And this is a real opportunity to do that and clear a lot of people out of prison who shouldn't be there.
It's a really interesting and indeed thorny subject. I suppose there are strong arguments on both sides. When the Justice Secretary comes back to you, we must get you back on to look through exactly what has been decided in the end. But for now, James Daly, thank you very much for coming in and talking us through a really, really interesting case there. Well, moving on today, Simon Case, the head of the UK Civil Service, is looking into whether officials in Scotland should still be allowed to work related to a second Scottish separation referendum. Scotland's Secretary Alistair Jack said that the Cabinet Secretary and Whitehall's Propriety and Ethics team were examining whether it was appropriate for the work to continue on independence in light of this Supreme Court decision that only the UK government could allow another vote. Well, James Hanvey is the Alba Party MP for Kirkcaldy and Kelburn-Beth and has served as the leader of the Alba Party in the House of Commons since 2021, originally elected as an SNP MP, of course. But Neil, let's just look at this from the sort of perspective of what is constitutionally proper. Under the system of devolution, the Constitution itself is reserved to Westminster. Why should the Scottish Government be spending taxpayers' money on things that it's constitutionally not allowed to be exploring?
Well, if I could just start off. Good morning, Tom. I would like to wish everybody a happy St Andrew's Day today, which is Scotland's patron saint. The first place I would start is with the ruling and the assertion that this has somehow settled the constitutional issue. The Scottish Government, in my view, certainly sent the wrong person to the wrong court at the wrong time to ask the wrong question, because this is not about how the Constitution is resolved within the framework and the state apparatus of the UK, which is ostensibly what the judgment was about. And that's understandable because the Scottish Parliament is an organ of the United Kingdom state, and therefore those limits are part of that constitutional settlement. But the future of Scotland is not a matter for the UK solely or for domestic law. This is a matter of the ancient nation of Scotland re-establishing its rightful place as an independent member of the international community. And our position is that it's the people of Scotland, the sovereign people of Scotland, who have the right to self-determination, to freely determine our political status, and to pursue our economic, cultural, and economic and social development as an independent country. And I don't think anybody is in the position to tell us that we can or can't do that. Now, whether the position of the Scottish First Minister is that she will accept that the work from civil servants within the UK state apparatus should stop or not, that's a battle that she must consider her position on. But what I would say is that certainly in some regards, that would be liberating for the movement, because actually some of the output from the Scottish Government has been less than enthusiastically received within the independence movement, and to suggest that there are no other minds in Scotland that are capable of mounting robust arguments, whether in domestic law or indeed in the international context, is frankly fanciful. There are plenty of sharp minds willing and able to establish a prospectus for an independent Scotland, independent of the Scottish civil service, and that might actually be a welcome thing.
That's a really interesting point, that perhaps Simon Case is right here, that this shouldn't be something that the organs of the Scottish government gets up to. I wonder, looking back to what happened in 2014, in that first referendum that was fairly decisive in terms of the Scottish people voting to remain within the United Kingdom, do you think perhaps that the organs of the Scottish state, in terms of that devolved government, were maybe used too heavily? That big manifesto that was produced in terms of the Future for Scotland document that no doubt had civil service work behind it, that to some extent was something that hampered the partition cause rather than helped it.
Well, I mean, look, you can call it partition and separatism if you like, Tom, but we're talking about an ancient nation that was independent for millennia before the Acts of Union came into being. So this is about reinstatement of that international sovereignty that's recognised internationally. In terms of the use of the civil service, I mean, there's a very clear counterpoint here. When a government is elected on a manifesto with a central ambition, it is completely justified that they use the apparatus that's available to them to prepare and advance that case. If that weren't the case, then the UK government shouldn't have spent a penny on a referendum to leave the EU. So, there is a clear democratic mandate in Scotland for a further vote on independence, whether on a point of law and the power of the Scottish devolved settlement is either right or wrong in law, that doesn't change the politics. The politics are that the people of Scotland have asserted their right and determination to have a further vote. And the Scottish government...
I suppose the only issue there is when that vote may take place. Of course, many people will remember the once-in-a-generation calls back in 2014, which by my maths would take us to about 2044 or thereabouts. Of course, it was around. It was a long, long time that the United Kingdom itself got its votes between the EU. What was that? 75 to 2016. But we will have to continue this conversation another time, Neil Hanvey, because we've reached the end of the programme. But thank you so much for advancing your case here on GB News today. We really appreciate it. That's it for me today. Coming up, it's Bev Turner with Bev Turner Today. So stick around for that after the weather.
Hello, good morning to you. Another misty start for many of us. A lot of low cloud and fog around as well. It's also chilly out there, whether you've got the low cloud or the clear skies first thing. We've got high pressure in charge right now. That high pressure really dominating our weather during the next few days and beyond, keeping weather fronts at bay from the west, although this one is